Is there anything that I'm missing that you want to talk about?
Can't think about it. I mean, I'll think about it, but
As you're talking about
sometimes
things
him and I
along.
would just get up and go fishing, or
Oh, I love that. All right, I guess we're going again. So, welcome, guys. Welcome to Life at 2030 with us. And today we have Dad, of course. I've roped you into this. You're not going anywhere. And thanks for being here, John. And we have Mom and Allison hanging out on the couch with us. We have this deep red couch in this zigzag room, and it's just a fun place for us to all hang out together in this tiny little room. Today, I'm so excited. We're going to be talking about, my great grandpa, Hawley, your grandpa, Dad, Fawn Roy Hawley. And we're going to talk about all the fun that he was, and then we will have a time where we talk about Grandma Hawley and Delta and just all the fun that we've had there. But Grandpa is such a character in himself that we just need to paint a picture of him and talk about his just the habits, just the little things about him that remind us of him. And so, Dad, who was Fawn Hawley?
well, he was a farmer in Oasis, Utah, and my father was from Deseret, and my grandmother. When my father was 15 years old, he had a little brother and a little sister. My dad's father left my grandmother for another woman, and so my my grandmother and my dad and his siblings moved in with her mother and dad in Deseret, the Cahoons, and then Grandpa came into their life. I don't even remember how Grandma and Grandpa met.
I know. I've talked to Aunt Marlena and Grandpa about this. So Grandpa asked her to a dance, and because he had been watching her for like a year, and he thought she was something special, and said, "Hey, let's go to a dance," and they just started dating after that.
Wasn't he in his 40s?
When they got married, he was 49
Yeah.
or 50, something like that.
So anyway, Grandpa joined our family then, and so he was taking care of his mother in a farm in Oasis, and so I'm not sure whether she passed away just before that. And so Grandma Stella and Grandpa Fawn and my dad and his siblings moved into the farmhouse in Oasis, and he was my grandfather. I was his oldest grandson, his grandchild. And when I got a little older in the summertime, I started going there and working all summer, and I'd work for the other farmers. I would buck hay, I would shovel grain, I would change water turns at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. If farmers wanted me to help them with that, I'd do that. Change water for Grandpa. He raised cows. We went to auctions and bought cows.
And can I ask you really quick, what kind of a dad was he, like a stepdad to your dad and your uncle and aunt? Because that was quite a time for them.
He loved them as children. I mean, they became his children, and we became his grandchildren. They became sealed in the temple, so he is our grandfather. He was a World War II veteran. He
I love that story, by the way, when he went to the war. Where what was that? On Tuesday, he harvested his field, and on Thursday, he went to war, right?
Yep.
But he was only gone for a little bit because at that point, he was in his 40s, and they said, "What are you doing here? We're going to send you home."
Yeah, he was a medic, worked in the hospitals and stuff, so. Plus, he was the lone support of his family.
Yeah.
So, I mean, back then, and he was a great farmer, and he raised chickens, and so in the summertime we'd go down there when I was a little younger, and the chickens that weren't laying eggs, we would chop off their heads and we would boil them and put them in really hot water and then pull the feathers off and then singe them over a pan.
How did you know they weren't laying eggs?
Grandpa Hawley knew.
Oh, okay. He just looked at them. You don't.
By the age, he could tell.
How ruffled their feathers were.
And sometimes we'd take 150 chickens home and share them with Aunt Marlena
and how many
Dale.
Little baby chicks would you guys order?
Grandpa would get in 2,000 to 3,000 chicks at a time.
That's a lot.
And so we went and gathered eggs. Grandpa would send these cases of eggs, and they probably had 50 dozen eggs, maybe 100 dozen. I don't know. They were big cases, and the people would come in trucks and pick them up.
Like every Friday.
And we had to clean the eggs. We had to candle them. You would put each egg on a light and see if there was blood in it. If there was no blood and they were clear, then we could sell them. Otherwise, if they had blood in them, we had to throw them away. So every egg had to be candled and cleaned.
Oh, wait, you didn't throw the eggs away, right? Remember what you said?
Well, that's just the ones that were broken. If we found a broken, cracked egg, Grandpa would just suck it down. He didn't want to waste an egg, but the bloody ones he didn't want.
What was your reaction when he did that, when you first saw him do that?
Well, I saw him do it, and he said it was great, and I tried it once, and I threw up for like 3 days, so...
And Grandpa was a pretty smart businessman, actually. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things I learned is Grandpa, well, besides that he wore a pith helmet, Grandpa wore coveralls and a pith helmet.
Striped overalls.
Right, striped overalls. And I don't know if you know what a pith helmet is, but postmen wear them. The hat, the hard plastic hat. And the reason he wore a pith helmet was because it was a protection for the head, kept the sun out, and periodically when you were growing hay or grain, you would have to go out in the middle of the field and pop the heads of the grain into the helmet and see what kind of bugs were there, especially when the wheat was starting to harden. Because a certain bug would come and suck the grains of wheat out while they were still liquid. So we would check that, and if we saw the wrong bugs in there, then we would go get the tractor and the sprayer. Later on, when I got a little older, we would call the airplane, and sometimes we hadn't even made it back to the field by the time he was buzzing the field, spraying it.
Oh, wow. It's that important.
Right, and so Grandpa was approached by the Japanese once, and they wanted to buy all of his hay. And so he planted the kind of hay that they wanted, and they would send a cubing machine in. And this machine would compact the hay and squish it out of this form in little cubes. And then the truck would be alongside and take the cubes, and they would ship them to Japan for their famous Kobe beef. And
wow.
And so Grandpa was making a lot more money doing that
than the eggs.
Right. And he was the hardest worker I ever met. I went there one summer, and I believe he was in his middle 70s. Could have even been late 70s. And he said, I need to put a new roof on my garage. And he says, I only want to put one more roof on. So we stripped it down to the wooden slats that were about, 8 inches wide. We went and bought pallets, bundles and bundles of wood shake shingles. And with a temperature of 106, 107, him and I are on the roof putting up these shake shingles. And he outworked me.
Wow. He was that steak and potatoes guy, too.
He had bacon and eggs, and he lived to be 100 years old.
Yeah, that's right. He was born in 1899, and when he died, he was 26 days short
26
of living
days
in 3 decades.
3 centuries.
Or centuries, not decades. Wow.
3 centuries.
So explain to me, whenever we talk about Grandpa, it's all the little details that we bring up but that just remind us of him. And my favorite, and my daughter's taken this on, or those pink mints that he would have in the mason jar. He had his own set of drawers across from the bathroom where he would keep his wallet, his hat, and in one of the drawers was a mason jar with pink mints and a mason jar with M&Ms, and the M&Ms were always gone within an hour of us showing up. And the pink mints we just had to tolerate, but we grew to love them. And Emily, that's her favorite, and it's getting harder to find them, actually. We have to buy them on Amazon now, and it's really sad.
Everybody thinks Grandpa had a lot of drawers in that. Grandpa had one drawer. One drawer. He couldn't mess with the rest of the drawers because they had dish towels and Grandma's good linens and...
Those weren't his drawers, then?
No, he had one drawer.
My
and if
mind
he
is
put
blown.
anything... those two knobs were the most wore out in Grandpa's drawer.
But that was his. He had a drawer.
Right.
I mean, even his room. In his room, he had a big stand-up freezer. He had his own room. Why was that?
Well, he liked it cool. So he would sleep with all the windows open. And Grandma would sleep down the hall in her room. But Grandma was a light sleeper. And you couldn't sneak to the bathroom without Grandma waking up and handing you a flashlight. Grandma would always wake up. We tried to crawl on the floor to get past Grandma. And she would wake up and say, "Need a flashlight?"
Oh, and sorry to get off track on this, but we have to since we're already going there with the flashlight at Grandma's funeral.
And at Grandma's funeral, we're all sitting there in the chapel, and poof, the lights go off. The power goes out. So everybody runs out to their trucks and brings their flashlights in, and we finish the funeral with flashlights, which is pretty fitting for Grandma.
That was so amazing. That's a favorite memory. So, Grandpa, what are some other things that remind you of him? Because I did, the pink mints remind me of him. What reminds you of him?
His coveralls. He always wore coveralls. And he had one good pair of coveralls, brand new, that if we were going to town, he had to wear those or Grandma would let him have it. So I'd say, "Are we going to town?" And he'd go, "Yeah, let's go to town." And I say, "Grandpa, if we're going anywhere near D. Stevens, you need to get in your good coveralls. If we were just going to the co-op to buy bullets or food or order feed for the chickens or ordering more chickens, then we didn't need to go near D. Stevens. But if we were going anywhere near D. Stevens..."
Which is where Grandma worked. And
Grandma
she would
worked.
have caught you too. "Where are your good overalls, Fawn?"
And I guess one of my favorite... Grandpa used to keep this little brown bottle of cough medicine. And if I ever got a cough, he would say, "Take 1 tablespoon of this." And it burnt so bad all the way down that you didn't ever want to cough again.
Oh, no. And we
And-
all had to take that at least once.
Yes, and when I got older and we looked at the bottle, it was 44% alcohol. Sold out of the drugstore.
He sent you home with one of those brown bottles
Yes,
once.
he gave me one of those brown bottles. But one time I had a cough and I couldn't get rid of it. My hay fever was really bad that year. And Grandpa says, "Okay, it's time for you to take the real cough medicine. Come on with me."
Oh, no.
So I went upstairs in the upstairs room. He opened up his gun cabinet and he said, "This is the real cough medicine when you can't get rid of it." He said, "This is 100-year-old bottle of Jim Beam and it will cure the cough."
That'd be cool to see that bottle right now, actually.
I took a shot of that and I couldn't breathe for like 5 minutes.
Was Grandpa laughing at you?
No, but the cough went away.
Oh, well.
But I never wanted to see that cough medicine ever again.
He found the secret to get you to stop coughing. You never coughed around him anymore, did you?
No.
I don't blame you. Tell me some of his habits.
Habits. He got up early. He took a nap around noontime every day. He'd lay on the living room floor. If it was a Saturday, we would watch a baseball game. In the evening, they would turn on the radio because he loved BYU basketball, BYU football. If there was a game on, it was never on TV. So we went in the kitchen. They had an old, beautiful wood stove that they cooked on, but we used coal in it.
Was that the cream colored and the
right
light
until
blue?
Grandma bought an electric stove. Okay. So we would sit around the kitchen table listening to BYU football or basketball. These two turned into screaming animals when the game was on. They were hollering and yelling. And
so at Grandpa's funeral, tell the story about his home teacher with them screaming.
Yes, the home teacher came to the house and was going to knock on the door, but he heard them screaming, so he thought they were arguing. So when they finally let him in, they explained to him that it was just BYU sports.
Yeah, because you never heard those two argue or say a mean thing to each other, and so he was in shock. What is going on? Why are they screaming? So tell me, what Grandpa loved to get anyone by him so he could start telling his stories about when he grew up or when he would till or anything. What are some of these stories that you remember, if any at all?
I just remember his World War II stories, and he talked about how the fishing streams used to be full of fish, and now there's hardly any there, and about how many acres his family used to own. I mean, they used to own tens of thousands of acres in the area. But his father was a gambler and drank a lot, and so they lost a lot of land.
Oh, wow.
And Grandpa and I used to go to auctions. We'd go fishing. We'd go hunting. He taught me how to shoot a .22, and so I'd be plowing in the fields, and one day I shot 35 jackrabbits while I was plowing the field.
Oh, man.
And just plowed them under as fertilizer.
So as Grandpa started getting older, even like crazy things started happening, how he had to get his driver's license taken away because he nearly dumped the boys in the dump with the truck.
Well, Grandpa started driving by sound because he couldn't see and he wouldn't let anybody know. So there was a road, and then on the sides of the road were gravel. So when he heard the truck go in the gravel, he would turn it back onto the road. And they changed the dump to where it was a ramp that went up to these 3 big dumpsters. And one day he almost dumped the truck with some grandkids in the bin. So we knew it was time to not let him drive anymore, and he was actually fine with that.
Your dad said that was such a sad day to have to take his driver's license away.
But Grandpa would have felt really bad if he would have hurt someone.
Right.
And the same thing happened to my dad. One day we had to take his car away because he couldn't see. He finally went blind.
Yeah, and Grandpa Hawley, I think the hardest thing for him was to not drive his tractor anymore, because he would take that everywhere and take all the grandkids for a ride, and almost dumped us in the ditch as well. He was crazy. So I want to hear our favorite all-time story, low seas.
Oh, well, my grandma loved to be on the phone. When we first started going down there, they had party lines. So several people were on the same line. So Grandma would pick up the phone and listen to the conversations going on. And sometimes you'd pick up the phone to make a phone call, and 2 or 3 older ladies are talking on the phone. The conversations were great. But
You would sneak in on their conversation.
oh yeah, it was great. And so Grandma, one day I got there and Grandma had a cordless phone, one that just had a battery in it. And she said, "Paul, this phone doesn't work. The battery must be dead." So I said to Grandpa, "Well, where would we find a battery for this?" Because, those were kind of unique batteries. He said, "Well, let's go to Losey's." And I said, okay. I didn't know where Losey's was, so I counted on Grandpa, and he was getting pretty old then, probably in his 90s. And so I jumped in the car and we took off, and I said, where do we go? And he says, okay. So we went up the road, and he says, turn in here. Here's Losey's. So I turned in, and it was a radiator shop. And I said, Grandpa, this is a radiator shop. This isn't Losey's. He says, oh yeah, Losey's down there. So we went down and we found a big department store. There was a big kind of a warehouse. So I said, this Losey's? He said, yeah. So we went in there. It was a very unique store. It had one recliner and one couch. It had one of everything. And there was an old lady who came up and said, can I help you? And she didn't have any teeth, but she was twirling a toothpick in her mouth with her tongue forward, twirling it inside her mouth.
You're
And
mesmerized.
I couldn't take my eyes off this old lady with this toothpick rolling in her mouth with no teeth, but she was doing a really good job. And I said, do you sell phone batteries here? And she says, no, Losey's does next door, but they're closed.
Oh no.
And I'm like, oh man. I said, well, is there anywhere else we could get a battery? And she goes, you might try the drugstore. The drugstore was a little tiny log cabin type place. So I went in there not knowing if there was any chance of getting one. And I asked the lady, I said, do you have any batteries? And she said, see that little turnstile there on the counter? That's all the batteries we have. So it was probably 10 inches in diameter, probably 12, 14 inches tall.
Oh.
And you turned it. I'm like, there is no way.
Good luck.
So we're turning it, and there's C batteries on the top and D batteries and double A's, and all of a sudden on the bottom I looked and there were two phone batteries, and I looked and one of them was the battery we needed.
Yes.
Yes.
I love that.
Unbelievable. So Grandpa says, here, let me pay for it. So he went to pay for it. He pulled out his wallet. The wallet was empty. There was nothing in the wallet. It was an old wallet and there was nothing there. He said, oh, Paul, I got the wrong wallet. Here, you'll have to pay. So I bought the battery. And then he said, we need to go down to 7-Eleven and get us a drink, and I need a newspaper. He got the newspapers, but they delivered the Saturday and Sunday newspaper on Monday morning. So he wanted one on set. Don't ask me. So he would get Monday through Friday's newspaper on the right day, but the weekend papers, so he'd get 3 papers on Monday.
Who has time for that, right?
I don't know. But every morning he had the newspapers spread out. The Sunday comics were all over the kitchen table. And so we went into 7-Eleven. He bought a big drink and he bought the newspaper and he said, here, let me pay for it. So he pulled out his wallet and he says, I got nothing in my wallet. It's empty. I got the wrong wallet. I said, here, Grandpa, let me pay for it.
Yeah, he's like, I guess you'll have to pay.
He says, I guess you'll have to pay. So I paid for it. He says, we need to go down to the co-op. I need to get some things. So we went down to the co-op. He needed some pills for the cows, antibiotic pills. And so we bought the pills, and he wanted a couple of boxes of shells, 22. So we bought them. And he said, here, let me pay for these. So he pulled out his wallet a third time, and it was the same empty wallet with nothing in it.
Oh.
He says, oh, I guess you'll have to pay. So I paid, and we went home, and we put the battery in, and Grandma yelled at Grandpa for taking the wrong wallet.
Did he ever find his other wallet?
It was in the drawer. There were always 2 wallets in the drawer. He always, when he bought a new wallet, he would throw away the old wallet that was in the drawer and then put the wallet that he just used in the drawer. So there was always a wallet full and an empty wallet.
Oh, bless his heart.
So Grandma had her phone back, and I had an adventure of a lifetime.
You had quite a story to tell us all. I remember hearing that the first time, and we were just howling. Poor Grandpa.
The lady with no teeth and the toothpick,
That's my favorite for sure. And then Grandma and Grandpa got a lot older. Grandma fell over one time, and Grandpa was right there to help pick her up. And they just realized, this isn't okay for them to be a couple hours away from everybody. So everyone packed him up and moved him up to Bountiful. And Grandpa lasted in Grandma's apartment for a little bit, but he became...
Not very long, yeah.
He was hard to take care of. And so he was with Grandma and Grandpa Carling for a while, and they went to Lake Powell, and they said, Paul, we need you to babysit Grandpa.
Every time they needed to go somewhere, we went and babysitted Grandpa. So Melba and I are sleeping over a week or two.
I did also.
Oh, Allison went there too. But Grandpa, sometimes he was a naked ghost in the middle of the night when he would wet his bed. He would walk through the bedroom where we were at in to take a shower, or he'd mess his pants. And so Melba would just cover her eyes as the naked ghost walked by with the walker. Or he'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and want some pellets, which are
these Oreos.
Oreo cereal. So at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, we're sitting there eating pellets.
And one night you gave him a sleeping pill. Or was that Grandpa?
That was Grandpa.
Oh, that was quite the story too, how he just ripped his bed apart.
Yeah, ripped the bed apart, ripped his clothes off.
So you also made Grandpa a bologna sandwich one day.
Yeah, Grandpa wanted a bologna sandwich. And so bologna used to come in a tube, covered in a thin red film, cellophane type stuff. So I cut the sandwich and I put it on, made the sandwich, but I forgot to take the thin layer of film off. So Grandpa bit into the sandwich and he pulled out the red stuff, and he's told me that I forgot to take the skin off the bologna.
You forgot to take the
shell
shell
off the
of it. That made us laugh.
And Grandpa, it was funny. He would say he'd want to go for a ride, and so I'd take him into McDonald's, and I'd say, "Do you want some French fries?" And he'd go, "No, I don't want French fries." So I'd order 2 French fries anyway. He would eat one on the way home, and then when we sat on the front porch to eat them, he would eat the other one.
And he would play checkers with Allison too.
Well, he would play checkers with Allison, only Grandpa's idea of playing checkers, they had a big board with checkers probably 5 inches in diameter. And Grandpa, if he saw a move, whether he was the red or the black, he would just make it. Whatever move looked good, he would jump reds or jump blacks. And one day he was playing with Allison, and Allison stopped, and she said, "Grandpa, you cheat. You need to go back to primary." And so we all laughed that Grandpa needed to go back to primary.
I love
But it was great taking care of Grandpa. I learned a lot. It was kind of scary, but it was fun to get to spend more time with him than I had in the past.
And it's hard as they get older to see how their minds kind of slip a little, because even though this is funny, there was a part where Grandpa said, "Louise moved the bathroom."
Yeah. One day he says, "Paul, come here." And I said, "What?" He says, "Louise moved the bathroom across the hall." And I said, "Well, what are we going to do about it?" And he says, "Well, tell her to move it back." And I said, "Well, your room's moved over there, so it's okay." He's like, "Okay, well, it's okay if it's there then."
I'm sure you miss babysitting him.
Or we would drive into my mom and dad's house, and Grandpa would say, "Who lives here?" And I'd say, "Bob and Louise live here, and you do, Grandpa." And he says, "Oh, I live here?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Bob and Louise did good for themselves."
My favorite was every Friday I would take Grandma Hawley shopping, and I would make sure as often as I could to take her to Bountiful and visit Grandpa Hawley, and he would grab her hand and say, "Stella, you're the best thing that ever happened to me." And he said that all the time. And when Grandpa got pneumonia his last week on this earth, the last thing that he found out, well, he was talking with the nurse, and he said, "Hey, how did BYU do?" And the nurse said, "Fawn, I'm sorry, BYU lost." And he said, "Well, it figures." And that was the last thing he said. Oh, he's the best. I also reached out. My mom said the cutest thing about Grandpa Hawley, and so did my brother Jeff. Jeff said, "I love that he was always so excited to see you. His eyes lit up when you entered the room." And Mom said the cutest thing. She said, "Grandpa Hawley was one of a kind. I loved it when he said that marrying Grandma was the best thing he ever did, because look at the family he got." Because he didn't have family before Grandma Hawley. Well, his extended family, but he didn't have kids and a wife, and he certainly loved them so much. He loved us all, and we knew it. He would always slip some money in your hand and tell you not to tell Grandma, and then Grandma would do the same thing as Grandpa did. Mm-hmm. He liked to talk with anyone, and I loved to listen to him and learn from him. He would rather be in striped gray and white oak coveralls than anything. He was comfortable to be with and genuine in all he said and did. He was up to just about anything you wanted to do, especially getting spring water to drink from Oak City Canyon. I just have warm feelings of love for him, but when I think of Grandpa, I have to think of Grandma too. And don't you worry, we'll give Grandma so much justice as well. So Dad, I'm curious, what would you say if I were to ask you, what was the essence of Grandpa Hawley?
Hard work and love. I mean, he was never afraid to work. He was never afraid to help someone. And he always loved you. And the hardest thing to do was to leave their house and go back home with Grandma and Grandpa standing in the doorway waving at you.
Yeah, you just wanted to stay longer.
Because he was always glad to see you. He always. You were never an imposition to Grandpa. He always had patience no matter what.
I love
when you
that.
wake up, he knows that you're awake.
Oh yeah, I loved how Grandpa would watch us as kids. He would just sit there really quietly, and Grandma would say, "Fawn, leave the kids alone, let them sleep." And he's like, "I'm watching them." And then as soon as we'd wake up, he'd say, "You're awake, you're awake." He definitely loved being around us, and we didn't want to leave, like you said. I have one last question for you. What was the best advice that Grandpa ever gave you?
He gave you lots of advice. Probably the one I remember the most is he told me once, he says, "All things come to he who waiteth, if he worketh like hell while he waiteth."
Oh, that's a perfect
And
ending.
I asked him where he learned that from, and he said, "I don't know. It's always been in my head." But he was always happy and never afraid to try something.
And just wanted to show everyone that he loved them.
Once he tried a malted milk, it was over.
He always wanted a malted.
Always
like he
wanted
called
a
them.
malted.
Oh, I love that. We have his example and his generosity and everything to follow. And I'm so glad to have known Grandpa Hawley, and thank you for telling us all a little bit more about him. I know there's novels we could write about him.
Yeah, there's plenty.
But these are some of the cool moments and memories that we have, and we're so glad to share. So thanks for coming today, Dad. That was really fun to just have that memory.
No, thanks, Grandma and Grandpa.
Yeah. Hopefully they're listening too.
I hope they're busier than listening.
That's true. Well, we'll have you next time.
Okay, see you next time.
Bye, guys. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening.